podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome to everyone, dear listeners, to our latest episode of our podcast. And today, I have another great guest with me, an interesting person I've had the pleasure of working with for a few years now. This is Matthias Speidel. Matthias, welcome.
Yes, thank you for the warm welcome. I wish you the same. Best. I can't wait for what's next for us.
Yes, as always, we'll keep things relaxed and start off by giving a few snippets about what to expect. We'll start with you, Matthias. The person, Matthias, is important to me, and you have a very special profession. And that's also the second part, where we'll talk about child and youth welfare under the magnifying glass. Our young people are, as I wrote in the title, they're the greatest treasure we have. And how we deal with that is, at the very least, something that often needs to be discussed, I think. And that is exactly where the unique perspective of a seasoned expert, someone who has been actively working in this specialized field for well over a decade, is incredibly important. Break time equals 0.5s/, and for our third snippet, yes, you are also a highly experienced consultant and have been working with a dedicated focus on core values for quite some time now. Consulting using agile methods so that you can move companies forward. And I find this combination very exciting. And that's why I'd like to go into it with you to some extent, so I've looked into it for the first time today. Matthias Weil. These abbreviations are always so difficult. There's always the KJSH Foundation, they always say. And then there's KJHV. That's the network, so to speak, and I've now learned that KJSH is the Association for Child, Youth, and Social Services. And the KJHV is then the Child and Youth Welfare Association. But with K and J, you usually know what is meant. Children and youth, that's what's central. And you've been in regional management there for quite a while now. You can talk a bit more about the details in a moment. I really like a motto that you also write about. Everything starts with myself. And it's also a motto. I've dedicated a chapter to it in my last book as well. Self-leadership as the eternal first step. So, these are the things, first taking a look at yourself. And yes, as you just mentioned, we'll take a closer look at that in the third part. This values-based leadership and awareness approach. And that's something we want to take a closer look at later on as well. But now, what I'm most interested in, dear Matthias, is what motivates someone to go in this direction, to get into this field, maybe even as part of their training, to get involved in child and youth welfare. What were the main motives break time equals 0.5s/ that led you there?
Yes, dear Ollie, that's an interesting question, and I'd like to dive into that biographically. That's part of our work. So in social pedagogy, we usually work with biographies. We look at how parents, children, and youth have been socialized. And that's a really essential characteristic. And that's basically how every training to become an educator or social worker starts. So you start by looking within yourself. My background, in the end, is that I grew up in a large family. So, I have 6 siblings in total.
Wow.
I'm basically the oldest. And because of my background, I took on responsibility early on and stepped up to it. And life just played out in such a way that when I was 16, I lost my father, who held a position of great responsibility. He managed a company in a leadership role and, at the same time, was a father figure for us. He was there. And then, all of a sudden, that was gone. And my mom and I were, more or less, left to manage on our own with my siblings. And that's when I started thinking about, well, what can kids and teenagers do? What do we actually have to do? And the topic of self-leadership was front and center. So, how do we, as a family, get through this trauma? That's where my life journey began, and as life goes. So, in my first career, I didn't go straight into social pedagogy because I wanted to follow in my father's footsteps as a mechanical engineer. At least, I wanted to work in the metal industry, and so I trained as a toolmaker. but I quickly realized that I was always more interested in people. Not so much the machine tools themselves, which I could handle, but people themselves. So, those were the conversations during breaks. It was about the life stories of the individual people. And at some point, I had to decide whether to join the military or do community service instead. Back then, you had to apply for it, so to speak. You had to justify your decision in the 1990s. And I decided to do community service. And there, during this community service, I realized that I might have a calling to work with people because I felt that I could reach them. I realized that I had a certain sphere of influence also in terms of how I think, and that I am capable of self-reflection, and that I also have the necessary empathy to really put myself in other people's shoes. So I decided to go into social pedagogy, to give up my career once again, to find a new direction there. And then, as a young man of 26 or 27, I got into social pedagogy. And there I said, okay, I want to create value there, specifically by working with youth and children. Ultimately, to work with those who are on the margins of society. We're talking here, in the end, about people or children who have emotional impairments.
And
I started working with these children and did so with a lot of joy. And in fact, at one point or another, I was able to reach not only children and youth, but also the families behind them, and help them develop. And so it happened that, as a person, I adopted a resource-oriented approach very early on. So, not to focus on a person's deficits, but rather on their resources and possibilities. And that has stayed with me to this day. I've now had the privilege of working for the Kajitov organization for 25 years.
yes,
So this has accompanied me right up to today.
that's great. I'd like to go back for a moment because you said at 16, at that age, you're still really, really young and you had so much responsibility. I myself also grew up with 5 siblings. So I know what that means and how you learn socially in that environment. But I mean, at 16 and being the oldest, I don't know exactly what the age range was. From you down to the youngest child, actually. But that's definitely something to deal with, and it's not exactly easy. Would you maybe like to say a few words about that? Maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences. Because I really think that's a huge challenge, if not a real test, at such a young age.
Exactly, that's the point. So how do I deal with it? How did I handle it? It was like this. I decided for myself, after I realized my mother was also starting a new chapter, she met a new partner who very lovingly took in my little siblings as a social father. And for me, the path was more or less clear, and I also took the opportunity to leave the state capital Schwerin and move to Lübeck,
And
to start a new life there. So for me, it was also. These big shoes of my father's were just so overwhelming in the end, and the trauma was still affecting me, so I said to myself that a social change, a change of residence, but also ultimately a change in culture. Experiencing people in a different way, experiencing other cultures as well. In Schleswig-Holstein, that helped me move forward on my path in life, and that's how it ended up working out in the end. You can imagine, and so can the listeners, of course, that starting out in a new province was actually really tough. And of course, it took me a year or 2 to really assimilate, to adapt myself there. And, accordingly, the new understanding of the new culture, the new values, and the new attitude that I learned through friends and supporters, to whom I owe a lot. I have a lot to thank them for. In the end, I was nothing more than a little refugee myself. That's why I can really empathize today with people fleeing from Ukraine or from other parts of the world to us. I can really relate to that, how hard it is to get to know the culture. And I didn't even have to learn the language, I already knew it. But understanding the culture, that took a bit of time. And that's why, for me, it was important to say, yes, I want to give back a bit of what I experienced in the early 1990s in Schleswig-Holstein. I want to give back, and I want society to benefit from that as well.
Yeah, and I really mean it. If you take a close look at the KJ now, and you have been deeply involved here for a very long time, then, looking back at everything, it is definitely something that was a sincere decision from the heart. Break time equals 0.5s / something that you were naturally drawn to in a very powerful way. But how should we, as outsiders, imagine such organizations? And with that, we're actually at the second point of our structure, to go ahead and say, yeah, when you're just out and about in society, yeah, there's something like a youth welfare office, or of course, there's some kind of social work. But you really have no idea what kind of structure or processes are actually behind it all. And maybe you could give us laypeople, so to speak, in child and youth welfare a bit of an introduction and show us, okay, what's your approach? How are you set up? And yeah, of course, what are the really pressing challenges, problems, maybe with some examples or something like that? But let's just toss the ball back and forth.
Gladly. So, ultimately, our work is based on Social Code Book 8. So, in the history of the Federal Republic, there was an amendment in the 1990s. At that time, Social Code Book 8 was reissued. Social Code Book 8 states that independent organizations are usually the norm. That could be an association, so a registered association, or a nonprofit limited company, a nonprofit GmbH, that can be founded. The founders should generally be professionals, so either social workers, educators, psychologists, or have therapeutic training with certified standards, which also meet what's called the professional qualification requirement. The founding of these associations is also subject to review by authorities, as well as municipalities and independent cities. That means, for example, a state youth welfare office or a ministry, here in Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, decides to what extent the founding of an association is professionally sound. And you receive what's called provider recognition from a municipality, and are then allowed to work with the municipality. Together with a municipality or an independent city, you are then allowed to establish this association. Then you have the authorization to offer what's called help with upbringing. That's the term under Social Code Book 8. And accordingly, negotiations about fees are held with the relevant authorities in order to provide residential services, that is, for children who, for whatever reason, can no longer live under their parents' care and are allowed and able to live elsewhere. And on the other hand, help with upbringing is also provided in the area of prevention, so that children, youth, and families can also receive counseling on matters of parenting issues, on matters of value orientation. That's exactly what we do at Profiling Values as well. That's what we've been practicing very early on in child and youth services, specifically under the term resource-oriented approach, meeting children where they're at. And of course, also the parents, or whoever has custody. This could also be an aunt, uncle, or grandparents. So, we're responsible for that as well. I hope I was able to answer the question for the listeners, and for you as well. Yes.
Yes, very informative. So, if I understood correctly, the funding mainly comes from public sources because as the provider, you basically become an entity, a unit, with which, as you just mentioned, you can enter into negotiations about fees. But of course, there are probably, or at least I assume, combinations where private funds, if someone wants to make a donation or something similar, can also be included. How does the funding actually work? This might be a bit of a technical question, but as an entrepreneur, it's always important to me.
So, we are fundamentally a company operating in the social economy, which means we handle taxpayers' money, which ultimately comes from the respective municipalities and districts, in a highly efficient and responsible manner. That means all the plausibility checks are carried out in every possible way. That's one aspect. The second aspect is, and this is just how it is, the different municipalities are, of course, not all the same, equipped the way you might imagine. Especially in the current situation, that's actually quite difficult, and of course, we do face challenges here and there. We're also open to pension funds, which we then pass on to the children, the youth, and the parents, with the idea, and I think this is really important, that this is a core feature of the Kriegers KJV Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in terms of resource-oriented talent development. There's just not much leeway in economic terms. That means, for example, if a child really wants to take violin lessons, then of course it's up to the public sector to support that as well. But ultimately, it can't fully cover those expenses in that way, so it can't provide counterfinancing to that extent. And at this point, we're open and really happy when we receive these funds from business partners or through donations. And in the end, we can also say, yes, we've got a young person here, we've got a young mother with a child, we've got that as well. So we also have mother-child facilities. That means we can provide special support for talent development and offer additional help there. And that's also with financial means, so with fiscal resources.
So, it's great that you brought that up. Hey, let's talk about that again sometime, because our company, as part of our social responsibility, of course, does something like that every year. Or does other things, so that it bears fruit. Baden-Bodenfeld. And now I've understood it well. Here, it's basically about something extra, something that goes a bit beyond the usual, so to speak, where you can really make a great contribution. I myself was lucky enough to receive instrumental support with piano lessons as a child, and I can imagine that, for example, though it could also be a sport or something completely different, that this is something that really adds a little something extra. It makes a difference. And if there are opportunities for private companies to contribute as well, then I think that's something really, really good. I think that's a good approach, and it's nice that we mentioned it. So, what I'm really curious about now, Matthias, without wanting to sound negative, but what would you say are the biggest, most challenging problems you encountered break time equals 0.5s/ when you actually get involved in the process? Where can you then? I think you can also draw conclusions about what kind of overall societal problem this is. Hartmann once put it nicely, we're not a social animal, as some other philosophers claim. And similar ideas, it's not that we're just a product of society or something like that, but rather, we are a product of love. So, we're a product of the love of people. And society suffers a bit from a lack of love, a shortage, really. Of love, as Hartmann put it. And I mean, from my perspective, you're right there on the front lines when it comes to this, right where the problems are and where they become visible. So to speak, at the front, when it comes to this, really where the issues are and where they show up. What are your impressions or maybe even your conclusions after all these years?
Well, I think we need to have a society-wide conversation about the importance of attachment and relationship work, especially in parental care.
Yeah.
We are definitely seeing a societal trend where we talk about a kind of neglect that comes with affluence. These are parents who are very, very focused on their careers and professional lives. And as a result, their children are often well off financially and materially well taken care of. But on the other hand, in some areas, these children aren't getting enough support for their development. And on the other hand, we have a social phenomenon where, for 2, 3, 4, and even, across Germany, 5 or 6 generations, there are families in which an awareness is passed down to find your niche within your social class and not to stand out from the system, so that your child doesn't achieve a different level of education. It's precisely the topic of self-management, that talents are encouraged from the very beginning, that language development is supported, that motor skills are promoted, because these things weren't established in previous generations of the family. And these are, by now, that's also the magnifying glass, ultimately, that we have to describe. Within the middle class, so to speak, the societal middle class, we still have quite eloquent parents who are very caring and also very proactive. And on the other hand, at the margins, if you will, we do see the phenomenon, as I just mentioned, where there is a deficit, where there is a regression.
Oh, even regression, yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, but I can really relate to it. I mean, to me, sometimes it does seem a bit, well, even a bit crazy when you think about it. And I also mentioned it in the episode description that for all sorts of things, you need certifications, you need licenses, you need accreditations and all sorts of things like that. especially in the business world, for all sorts of things, even relatively minor ones. And the only thing you can do completely without any prior training, certification, or exam is have and raise children. And yet, as I wrote, and as Hartman also puts it, these early years are essentially the most formative, our greatest treasure. Irreplaceable. We have to make sure that we really pass on good values here so that they can take root and flourish. And on the one hand, I have the thought, good grief, can't we somehow put this on a different footing, make it much more preventative, so that we don't just end up running a repair shop, but instead, just like with health these days, we say, let's focus much more on prevention. The same should apply to raising children, upbringing, or whatever you want to call it. Something should be introduced here as well. Are there actually any movements in this direction, or is it ultimately always just about, okay, something has happened and now we just have to help as best we can?
Well, in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, we've actually seen some interesting developments. I'd like to mention this here, and I'm going to get a bit political again. Manuela Schwesig, the minister-president of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, made it her mission, and it was implemented accordingly, that every family receives a free daycare spot. And that's definitely a policy that puts a strain on the province's social funds, and also on the municipalities and district events. On the other hand, of course, it's also the case that the pedagogy within the daycare centers already has an influence on the parenting behavior of mothers and fathers.
So,
An investment. At the same time, it also affects the child's behavior. Ms. Schwesig might not even really experience the results of this investment from my professional perspective. Rather, it may only become apparent in 10 or 15 years. So to what extent is this investment really in pedagogy? That is, making a daycare spot available to every child and every family, how effective is that? And to what extent does it also influence a generational awareness? Because that's what it comes down to in the end. After all, we want social pedagogy and also the value orientation that Hartman ultimately makes visible for us. We want to create generational sustainability. And that's happening here in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern on the one hand. But now, on the other hand, we still have another problem, and that's the issue of school education. So, what I really wish for is that, nationwide and across the board, we ultimately need subjects in school education. I would say starting from grade 6 or 7 and up, moving in that direction. Even in high schools or secondary schools, students need lessons that are relevant to everyday life. And on the one hand, these can be the basic cultural skills of life, but on the other hand, also questions about parenting and pedagogy or other questions. Also, by dealing with topics like values and attitudes in courses like Profile in Values.
now, that right there.
The topic of responsibility is still not covered in school subjects. These subjects don't exist. And at one point or another, things like this are discussed, even here at the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Schwerin, here in Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania. But so far, implementation is still lacking, and basically, you've brought another important topic to light, which is also very close to my heart. We, as the KJHV and V organization, are also involved with the topic of parent competency training. I'm a trained parent coach myself. And that's exactly where certain characteristics come in. How do I raise my child? With what attitude? With what skills, if you will? How do I make that visible in myself? Everything starts with myself. That's our motto. So, what comes from within shines outward. And of course, how do I pass that on to my child? If we now circle back to the topic of the Y and Z generations, where we as entrepreneurs also look at how we can get young people to take on responsibility, we're kind of at the point where we have to admit that's something we've brought on ourselves. We were the ones who drove our kids to school. They didn't go to school independently. We protected them from harm, making sure nothing ever happened to them. And that they don't get any scrapes, no bumps, and no scratches. And so on. I think the viewers, or rather the listeners, already know what I mean. What I also want to say is that this overprotectiveness is a really significant characteristic. And that's exactly what we want as a child and youth welfare association, to give children and families more confidence again, to give them more responsibility when it comes to their own resources, and of course to make those visible together. Through good conversations, in coaching sessions, and ultimately also in the daily routine, so to speak, within the framework of residential child and youth care. So, good and well-structured routines, people we employ there who, for example, demonstrate resource-oriented and nonviolent communication. These things serve as role models. These are all things we deal with. That's a brief snapshot.
Thanks for the insight, especially the point about overprotection, which you also mentioned. I find that very, very relevant, actually. And it makes it easier for us, or, let me put it this way, the technical possibilities lure us even further into the trap of overprotection. When I think back, decades ago, how I used to head out after school and homework to play football somewhere or ride my bike around. And yeah, well, it never even crossed your mind. Instead, parents just knew you'd be home at a certain time. And those are such natural things that, nowadays, with, well, I'd say almost step-by-step surveillance, become more difficult. So, giving responsibility earlier on really means letting go, from the parent's side. But that brings me back around to my point. Given all the background you've just described so well, and the challenges we're facing, you've been working as a consultant for quite some time now. You use agile methods, but you also really focus on this values-based approach in your work. I think Hartman also contributed a bit to how you grounded this for yourself, and then you encounter companies. You help them move forward in various areas. And what's important for me to hear is, what are your experiences there? What have you experienced? And not everyone has the same background as you do, built up over decades. How do you see this in light of your own personal experience, child and youth services, the younger generation, and then you move into companies? There's probably often no awareness of this at all. And he knows that. Is it really that important? So, how do you experience your consulting work?
It's really fascinating. You're really speaking to me here, and I can feel how what you're saying is touching me inside, because it's exactly the kind of thing that usually never comes together in everyday life. And so I get to develop leaders and share not only my professional expertise, but also my personal values with them. And I also get to pass on the experiences I've had as a leader over many years that I gained in the social sector. Now I get to share that in the private sector as well. And what I'm noticing is this, in the social sector and also in child and youth services, when I bring up case studies, especially on the topic of self-leadership, then I can certainly use examples that, for leaders who have been socialized in a typical middle or upper class environment, might, at certain points, can really open their eyes as well.
Very good.
And I use that too, but I don't do it consciously. It just happens unconsciously. That also becomes apparent through the unconscious coaching approach, and just last week I had the opportunity to work with 13 leaders over a day and a half. And of course, in that setting, I end up sharing from my experience in child and youth services as well. And also about life events, especially when it comes to crises, like we're discussing at the start of our podcast. How do we deal with them? And how have I grown from these crises? And how can we, as leaders, also handle crises and crisis management? And I'll be completely honest, yes, that. I've faced many tests in my life already. And people say that I'm a good crisis manager. Not just that, but I can also draw from this wealth of experience and pass it on to others. And what I also notice is that this brings a certain humility for us as leaders, especially in the private sector, making us aware of the comfort zone we're operating in. And also that there are people living on the margins of society who don't really register in my portfolio or even in my awareness.
People you don't even have on your radar, and I also think that's just how it is. that especially the examples you just mentioned, from other walks of life, if you want to put it that way, they sort of intuitively exist within you. Then they come about because the associations, the synapses in your brain and your heart, just form accordingly. And I firmly believe in that. It's also kind of how should I put it? My experience in consulting is, the more often you step outside the pure work context and you can, so to speak, bring in other life contexts. And when you share, let's say, striking things or unique aspects that promote deeper insight, break time equals 0.5s/, it leaves a much more powerful and lasting impression that truly sticks with people. Because, as I see it in many companies, people, and that includes the leaders, are just moving around in their pure work world context. And that's the framework they think in. And especially when you're supposed to develop further, you have to break out of the daily routine and, so to speak, look beyond your own nose and see things from a completely different perspective. And I believe you can share incredibly good, instructive, but sometimes probably also deeply moving, striking examples.
That's right. Exactly, that's how it is. And on the other hand, I also want to swing the pendulum towards the company KJV or KJSA. Of course, we also benefit from the perspectives of the private sector and from the attitudes found in the private sector. Again, at this point, a nod to the company profiling values and also the topic of profiling. We really apply this here, even in the context of child protection. If we're not sure whether people are operating with a high level of self-efficacy, people whom we then have working alone on 24-hour shifts with children and youth, where, so to speak, the 4 Eyes principle, a control system, can't be implemented for various reasons, including different legal reasons, because staffing ratios make up a large portion of our costs in this field. Then we use profiling values in the profiling process to see to what extent empathy, awareness of needs, practical competence, and of course, results orientation and goal orientation are developed. We have these conversations both with our colleagues and with applicants. And of course, we want to attract people who ideally already bring a high level of self-efficacy with them, or who are on their way to developing it, or are open to starting that journey. To say, oh, that's an interesting field. I've never thought about that before. I want to learn more about it, and ultimately, I'm open to this values-based leadership, if you will. And we have very different experiences with that. And I want to point out here that it's not so easy, because the social sector is also affected by the shortage of skilled workers. And despite all that, we still stick to these values because we know that when people are reflective, ultimately, those who are biographically reflective are intuitively, joyfully, and peacefully present with the child. And that's the core message. What comes from within shines outward.
I can't add much to that, dear Matthias. I thought that was truly a wonderful closing statement. Thank you so much for investing your valuable time to talk with me here about these incredibly important topics, because our children and our youth really are the treasure of our society. So, this was a very insightful conversation and a great contribution. For our series here, where we say, yes, values, impulses, the podcast for potential development. I think you can take that literally, word for word, here. Matthias, thank you so much for being here with us. And yes, hopefully we'll see each other again very soon.
Thank you as well, and many, many thanks for this opportunity to say all this here again.
Great, see you soon. Bye.
Thank you very much.